For thousands of years, sages, mystics, and Stoic philosophers have whispered the same forbidden idea, that the external world is not separate from the internal one. Hermes Trismegistus called it mind-born reality. Plotinus described it as emanation from the One. Buddhist teachings point to perception as the source of suffering itself, different languages. Same structure, whatever you consistently focus on, mentally and emotionally, tends to grow in importance in your life. And the most forbidden claim of all, what you call reality, is not solid. It is responsive, and tonight, you'll see how these ancient systems describe the same mechanism, a hidden architecture of consciousness that shapes what you experience as the world. Before we go deeper, consider this. If two people live through the exact same event, why does one call it fate and the other calls it opportunity? What is actually changing, world itself, or the mind interpreting it? Hold that question, because every tradition we are about to explore begins there, at the point where perception stops being passive and starts becoming power. Chapter 1. The Principle of Vibration. A strange truth sits quietly beneath nearly every ancient wisdom tradition. Nothing in existence is truly still. The Hermetic initiates of Egypt believed this long before modern science discovered atoms in motion. Buddhist monks sensed it through meditation centuries before psychology began studying emotional states. Even the old mystics hidden within desert temples spoke of human beings not as fixed creatures, but as moving fields of energy constantly shaping perception itself. Everything moves, vibrates, radiates influence. Not only music, not only sound. Thought moves, emotion moves, attention moves. Fear moves faster than most people realize. A man walks into a room carrying anxiety, and before he speaks, others begin to feel tension around him. Another enters carrying calm certainty, and conflict softens without explanation. Most people call this intuition. Ancient traditions called it vibration. The Kybalion described this principle with unsettling simplicity. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. At first this sounds poetic, but lived experience quietly confirms it every day. Think of moments when fear consumed your mind completely. Suddenly the world itself appeared narrower. Possibilities vanished. Conversations became threats. Small uncertainties felt enormous. Your body tightened. Your breathing changed. Memory selectively searched for danger. Even neutral events began appearing hostile. Fear altered perception, not symbolically, literally. Modern neuroscience now explains part of this through survival mechanisms in the brain. Under fear, awareness contracts around threat detection. But ancient traditions understood the psychological consequence long before scientific terminology existed. Lower emotional states reduce clarity because they consume attention. Fear is heavy because it pulls consciousness downward into survival fixation. This is why desperate people often make destructive decisions, while calm people notice opportunities others miss. The external world may remain identical, yet perception changes completely according to internal state. A Buddhist parable tells of two travelers walking through the same forest at night. One believed spirits haunted the woods and heard danger in every movement of wind. The other believed the forest sacred and heard wisdom in the same sounds. Both experienced different realities while walking the same path. The forest did not change, their vibration did. Ancient initiates studied this carefully because they believed emotion was not merely reaction, it was energetic orientation. Emotional states determined the quality of awareness available to the individual. Anger distorted judgment, shame weakened vitality, Despair narrowed imagination, but elevated states, clarity, gratitude, discipline, devotion, expanded perception outward. This did not mean positive emotion magically erased suffering. Ancient wisdom was far less naive than modern motivational thinking. The Hermetic masters did not teach emotional denial. They taught emotional transmutation. The distinction matters enormously. Suppressed fear becomes internal poison. Observed fear becomes information. The initiate learns not to become emotionally hypnotized by temporary states. Instead, emotion becomes material to work with consciously. A story survives from an old Tibetan monastery about a young monk terrified of failure. Every mistake filled him with panic. Every criticism haunted him for days. His master eventually handed him a bowl filled with dark water and said, "Carry this through the mountain path." The young monk walked carefully, terrified of spilling it. But the more anxious he became, the more violently the water shook. Finally, exhausted, he stopped resisting and steadied his breathing. Slowly the water calmed. The master smiled and whispered, "The bowl was never the problem." This is the hidden secret of vibration. Emotional turbulence changes how reality is handled. Most people try controlling circumstances while remaining internally chaotic. Ancient systems reverse the order completely. Stabilize internal state first. Then perception sharpens naturally, because elevated emotional states do something extraordinary. They restore access to wider awareness. Think carefully about moments in your life when you felt deeply centered, not excited, not distracted, truly clear. Problems that once appeared overwhelming suddenly became manageable. You noticed solutions faster. Your words became measured. Your reactions slowed. Possibility returned. Higher emotional states widen reality. Fear compresses it. This is why nearly every mystical tradition emphasized practices designed to regulate inner condition. Meditation in Buddhism, contemplative silence in Hermetic temples, breath control in Taoist schools, disciplined self-observation in Stoicism. They were not escaping reality, they were refining perception. The deeper implication is unsettling. If emotional state alters perception, and perception shapes behavior, then much of human destiny is unconsciously driven by vibration people never examine. A fearful person unknowingly searches for danger. An ashamed person unconsciously expects rejection. An internally disciplined person naturally notices opportunities requiring patience and consistency. Inner state becomes external pattern, not through magic, but through sustained interpretation influencing action over time. And yet ancient teachings insist something even deeper. Vibration spreads. One emotionally unstable person can destabilize an entire family. One calm individual can regulate an entire room. Emotional energy is contagious because human consciousness constantly mirrors surrounding states. This is why initiates protected their mental environments carefully. The people you surround yourself with gradually influence your dominant emotional frequency. Constant exposure to bitterness, panic, outrage, or despair quietly shapes your perception until you mistake emotional contagion for personal identity. The ancients understood this danger profoundly. A fragmented environment produces fragmented consciousness. This is why the first practical discipline of vibration is awareness. Observe your dominant emotional atmosphere daily, not occasionally. Daily notice what repeatedly drains your energy. Notice which thoughts tighten your body immediately. Notice which conversations leave your awareness heavy and scattered. Most importantly, notice what emotional state you rehearse most often internally. Because repeated emotion becomes psychological climate, and psychological climate eventually becomes reality structure. This is not about pretending negativity does not exist. It is about refusing unconscious participation in emotional states that weaken perception and behavior. The initiate learns to ask constantly, "What energy am I feeding right now?" That question alone begins transformation, because awareness interrupts automatic vibration. And once awareness enters, choice becomes possible. Chapter 2. Hermes Trismegistus and the Secret Doctrine of Energy. History does not fully know whether Hermes Trismegistus was a real man, a fusion of multiple figures, or a symbolic embodiment of hidden wisdom. Yet for centuries, philosophers, mystics, alchemists, and initiates treated his teachings with extraordinary reverence, as if they contained dangerous truths about consciousness itself. In ancient Egypt, whispers spread through mystery schools about sacred teachings reserved only for disciplined minds. These teachings were said to explain the hidden architecture behind reality, the relationship between mind and matter, and the invisible energetic laws governing human existence. At the center of these teachings stood one terrifying principle: all is mind, not metaphorically, fundamentally. The Hermetic writings, later gathered within texts associated with the Corpus Hermeticum, suggested that reality itself emerges through consciousness. Matter was not viewed as dead substance separate from awareness. Instead, awareness was considered primary, the originating field beneath visible experience. To modern ears, this sounds abstract, but the ancient initiates approached it psychologically and spiritually at the same time. They observed something simple but profound. Human beings do not experience reality directly. They experience interpretations filtered through consciousness. Two people encounter the same hardship. One collapses into despair, another grows wiser through it. One interprets rejection as proof of worthlessness. Another interprets it as redirection. Same event, different consciousness, different reality experienced internally. Hermes taught that reality is shaped not only by events, but by the mind perceiving them. This became the foundation of Hermetic energy doctrine. A forgotten legend describes a young initiate entering an Egyptian temple beneath Alexandria. Before receiving any sacred teachings, he was taken into a silent underground chamber and left there alone for 3 days. When the priests returned, they asked him only one question: "What disturbed you most?" The initiate answered, "My own thoughts." Only then did the training begin, because the Hermetic masters believed uncontrolled thought created energetic disorder long before external chaos appeared. This is why the mystery schools protected consciousness teachings carefully. They understood that knowledge without discipline becomes dangerous. A fragmented mind given power becomes destructive to itself and others. Modern culture often imagines ancient initiation as dramatic rituals and hidden symbols, but much of the true training appears to have involved something far more difficult: disciplined self-observation, watching thoughts, observing reactions, studying emotional patterns, learning how internal states quietly shape external experience. Hermeticism taught that consciousness constantly radiates influence through attention, emotion, interpretation, and expectation. Not because thoughts magically rearrange the universe instantly, but because sustained internal patterns reshape perception and behavior continuously over time, and behavior reorganizes reality. A fearful mind unconsciously seeks evidence confirming fear. A disciplined mind notices structure and opportunity invisible to scattered awareness. Emotional states influence decisions, relationships, timing, resilience, and perception itself. This is why the Hermetic initiates viewed emotional mastery as sacred work. They understood something modern people rarely notice. Most human beings are not consciously thinking. They are unconsciously reacting. And reactions repeated long enough become identity. The phrase, "all is mind," therefore carried enormous responsibility. It implied that inner life matters far more than appearances suggest. Every repeated thought strengthens certain emotional pathways. Every emotional pattern shapes future interpretation. Every interpretation influences action. Your vibration slowly becomes external condition. A Renaissance alchemist inspired by Hermetic philosophy once wrote, "A poisoned mind transforms paradise into prison, while a disciplined mind finds order within chaos." That insight remains painfully relevant. Many people spend their lives attempting to manipulate circumstances while ignoring the energetic atmosphere within themselves. They obsess over outcomes while feeding fear internally. They seek peace while rehearsing resentment daily. They pursue clarity while drowning attention in noise and distraction. The ancient initiates would have considered this backwards. Reality changes indirectly through transformed consciousness, which is why the practical action within Hermetic teaching remains deceptively simple. Observe dominant emotional patterns daily, not to judge yourself, to understand yourself, because whatever emotional state dominates repeatedly begins shaping perception automatically, and perception, over time, becomes lived reality. The Hermetic path therefore begins not with controlling the world, but with becoming conscious of the energy constantly moving within you. Only then can reality begin changing from its hidden source outward. Chapter 3. Buddhism and the Illusion of Mental Suffering. An old Buddhist teacher once held up a glass of water before his students and asked, "How heavy is this?" The students gave different answers. Some guessed a few ounces, others said perhaps a pound. The old monk smiled gently and replied, "The weight does not matter. What matters is how long you hold it." Then he lowered the glass and whispered something the students would remember for the rest of their lives. Suffering grows heavier when the mind refuses to release it. This was one of Buddhism's deepest psychological revelations. Human suffering is often intensified not by the event itself, but by attachment to mental interpretation. Pain exists, loss exists, fear exists. But the mind repeats, magnifies, replays, anticipates, and emotionally feeds these experiences until temporary pain becomes permanent identity. Ancient Buddhist teachings describe this process almost like an energetic loop. A thought appears. The mind clings to it. Emotion strengthens it. Attention feeds it. Repetition deepens it. Eventually, the person no longer experiences the original event. They experience the mental echo endlessly recreated within consciousness. Fear survives through repetition. A single fearful moment rarely destroys a human being. But mental rehearsal can. This is why Buddhism places extraordinary emphasis on awareness of thought and emotion. Not because emotions are evil, but because unconscious identification with them creates suffering. There is a profound difference between feeling fear and becoming fear. Most people never notice this distinction. They say, "I am anxious. I am broken. I am angry." The emotion becomes identity, but Buddhist philosophy quietly separates awareness from emotional movement. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, they arise, move, dissolve. Like weather passing through the sky itself remains untouched. You are the awareness observing the storm, not the storm itself. That realization changes everything. A story from Zen tradition tells of a warrior visiting a monk after years of battle. The warrior confessed that fear haunted him constantly. Even during peace, his mind anticipated disaster. Every silence felt temporary. Every joy felt fragile. The monk handed him a candle and said, "Watch the flame carefully." Hours passed. Finally the monk asked, "What did you learn?" The warrior answered, "The flame never stayed still." "Exactly," the monk replied. "Why do you expect your mind to?" The warrior had spent years trying to force permanent emotional certainty. But Buddhism teaches impermanence as a universal law. Everything changes, every emotional state moves, every sensation passes. Clinging creates suffering because the mind desperately tries freezing what cannot remain fixed. This includes fear. Ironically, resistance strengthens emotional pain. The more violently people fight fear internally, the stronger it often becomes. Attention feeds it. Avoidance confirms its power. Suppression buries it deeper. Ancient Buddhist practitioners discovered something radical instead. Conscious observation weakens emotional identification. When fear is observed calmly, it begins changing shape. The body still reacts, the emotion still appears. But awareness no longer merges completely with it. Space enters the experience, and inside that space, freedom quietly begins. Modern psychology now confirms this through mindfulness research. Observing thoughts non-judgmentally reduces emotional reactivity because awareness interrupts automatic identification patterns. But Buddhist monks practiced this thousands of years earlier without laboratories or brain scans. They discovered through direct experience that emotions lose destructive power when fully witnessed without attachment. A wandering monk once described anxiety as a guest knocking repeatedly at the door of consciousness. Most people panic and invite the guest inside permanently. The awakened mind simply notices the knocking. This does not mean emotional numbness. Buddhism is not emotional suppression disguised as spirituality. In fact, true awareness often increases emotional sensitivity, but it changes the relationship to emotion entirely. Instead of drowning inside emotional states, the individual learns to observe them moving through consciousness naturally. This is where impermanence becomes liberating rather than frightening. Everything passes, fear passes, anger passes, shame passes, even joy passes. The ancient Buddhists believed suffering intensifies when humans demand permanence from temporary experiences. They cling to pleasure and resist pain equally, exhausting themselves fighting the natural movement of existence. But energy moves, reality flows, nothing remains fixed, even identity shifts continuously beneath awareness. A Buddhist parable describes a woman devastated by the death of her child. Broken by grief, she begged the Buddha to restore the child's life. Instead, he instructed her to bring him a mustard seed from a home untouched by suffering. She searched endlessly. Every house contained loss. Every family carried grief. Every life held impermanence. By the time she returned, something within her had changed. She realized suffering was not punishment directed personally at her. It was part of human existence itself. Her attachment to permanence had intensified the pain beyond the original loss. Awareness dissolved illusion. This remains one of Buddhism's deepest psychological teachings. Reality hurts less when we stop demanding permanence from temporary conditions, and this applies powerfully to fear-based consciousness. Many people unconsciously rehearse catastrophic futures daily. Their minds repeatedly imagine failure, humiliation, abandonment, collapse. Over time, the nervous system begins responding as though these imagined realities already exist. Thought becomes emotional conditioning. This is why Buddhist awareness practices emphasize returning to the present moment repeatedly. not because the present magically removes problems, but because fear often survives through imagined futures and repeated mental projection. The mind creates suffering faster than reality does. Ancient Buddhist masters understood this deeply, and so the practical discipline remains simple but transformative. Observe emotion without becoming it. Notice fear arising. Notice anger. Notice sadness appearing, but do not immediately call it me. Awareness creates separation between consciousness and emotional turbulence. And in that separation, suffering begins loosening its grip, because emotions are temporary visitors. Awareness is the one watching them come and go. Chapter 4. Plotinus and the One. A philosopher named Plotinus once described human existence as a kind of forgetting, not ordinary forgetting. A spiritual forgetting so deep that people mistake separation for reality itself. Living in the Roman Empire during the 3rd century, Plotinus became one of the great architects of Neoplatonism, a philosophical tradition inspired by Plato yet transformed into something mystical and vast. At the center of his teaching stood an extraordinary idea. All existence flows from a single infinite source he called the One, beyond language, beyond form, beyond division. Everything emerges from it like light radiating from a hidden sun, the stars, nature. Human consciousness, thought itself. According to Plotinus, separation is not ultimate reality, it is perception filtered through limited awareness. This ancient idea appears again and again across wisdom traditions. Mystics in different cultures repeatedly suggested that beneath surface individuality exists a deeper unity connecting all life. But Plotinus approached this not emotionally, but philosophically. He argued that human beings suffer partly because consciousness becomes trapped outwardly, obsessed with appearances, material identity, status, conflict, comparison, and external stimulation. The further awareness moves from inner stillness, the more fragmented reality appears. The result is psychological exile. A man becomes disconnected not only from others, but from himself. One story tells of Plotinus encountering a wealthy Roman politician obsessed with power and reputation. The man constantly feared betrayal and loss. Even surrounded by luxury, he remained restless. Plotinus quietly asked him, "How can a man possess peace while being possessed by everything around him?" The question haunted the politician because it revealed something terrifying. External abundance cannot calm internal fragmentation. Neoplatonism taught that the soul becomes scattered when it identifies completely with external reality. Attention pulled endlessly outward loses contact with its source. This is why returning inward became central to Plotinus' philosophy. Not escapism, not withdrawal from life, reconnection. He believed the soul could ascend gradually toward clarity by turning attention inward through contemplation, discipline, and stillness. The deeper the inward movement, weaker illusion became. Because separation itself was partly illusion, think carefully about moments when you felt completely connected to existence, not intellectually, but directly. Perhaps during deep silence, grief, awe, love, or profound presence. For brief moments, the constant sense of isolation disappeared, boundaries softened, life felt interconnected somehow. Plotinus believed such moments revealed glimpses of the One, not emotional fantasy, underlying reality. Modern people often dismiss these ideas because society trains attention toward material surfaces constantly. Yet psychologically, the consequences of disconnection remain everywhere: loneliness, anxiety, identity confusion, endless craving for validation. A fragmented consciousness searches externally for what can only be stabilized internally. Plotinus warned about this centuries ago. The more humans seek wholeness entirely through external conditions, the more unstable life becomes, because external reality constantly changes. Wealth changes, beauty changes, relationships change, power changes. Only inner alignment offers lasting stability. A profound metaphor appears throughout Neoplatonic thought. The soul is like a lake disturbed by endless winds. When the surface remains agitated, nothing reflects clearly. But when stillness returns, reality becomes visible again. Stillness restores perception. This is why so many ancient traditions valued silence, contemplation, meditation, and solitude. These were not primitive rituals disconnected from psychology. They were technologies of perception designed to calm fragmentation. The modern world trains constant stimulation. Plotinus trained return, and return begins inwardly. The practical action flowing from this philosophy remains timeless. Cultivate inner stillness regularly, not occasionally, regularly, moments without noise, without endless reaction, without constant distraction, because stillness reveals what scattered attention hides. When consciousness quiets, deeper patterns emerge. Emotional turbulence settles. False urgency weakens. The mind stops chasing fragments and begins sensing connection again. And perhaps this is the secret hidden beneath Plotinus' teaching of the One. Human beings suffer not only because life is difficult, but because they have forgotten their connection to something deeper than temporary appearances. The return inward is therefore not escape from reality. It is return to its source. Chapter 5. The secret of mental transmutation. There are emotions that destroy ordinary people, and the same emotions, when understood, become fuel for extraordinary transformation. That was the hidden lesson whispered through Hermetic schools long before modern psychology existed. The ancient initiates did not believe fear, anger, grief, or desire were enemies to be eliminated. They believed these forces were raw material, energy, unshaped fire, and whoever learned to redirect that fire could reshape the quality of their entire existence. In the deeper Hermetic traditions, this was called mental transmutation, the alchemy of consciousness itself. Not turning lead into gold, as legends later simplified it, but turning lower emotional states into higher forms of awareness. The Kybalion hints at this repeatedly when it explains that vibration can be changed through will and understanding. The initiate was taught that emotions are not fixed identities. They are movements of energy across the mind, temporary waves, frequencies, and frequencies can be altered. An old Hermetic story tells of a young disciple brought into an underground chamber beneath an Egyptian temple. The walls were covered in symbols of serpents, suns, scales, and eyes. At the center of the room burned a single flame. The disciple expected secret formulas or mystical chants. Instead, the master handed him a bowl filled with oil and said, "Carry this across the temple without spilling a drop." As the disciple walked, priests screamed insults at him. Others attempted to frighten him. Some praised him, others mocked him. Yet he kept his attention fixed on the bowl. When he returned exhausted but successful, the master asked him a strange question. What controlled your reality, their voices, or your attention? The disciple finally understood. Most people surrender emotional control to external conditions. Hermetic initiates trained themselves to reverse that process. They learned that attention directs energy, and energy shapes perception. A fearful mind sees danger everywhere. An angry mind sees enemies everywhere. A desperate mind sees rejection everywhere. Reality begins organizing itself around emotional expectation, quietly, gradually, completely. This is why mental transmutation was considered sacred knowledge. It revealed that the mind is not merely reacting to life, it is participating in it. Watch a person consumed by anxiety for several months. Their body changes, their posture changes, their voice changes, their decisions narrow. Opportunities become invisible to them because fear compresses awareness. They stop seeing possibilities and begin scanning only for threats. The external world may remain unchanged, yet their experience of reality becomes smaller, darker, and more hostile. Now observe someone who has learned emotional discipline, not forced positivity, not denial, real discipline. Even in difficulty, their mind remains clear. They move deliberately. They notice opportunities others overlook. They influence rooms without speaking loudly. Ancient teachers describe this as energetic coherence, inner order producing external influence. The difference is not luck. It is transmutation. A Stoic philosopher once wrote that fire consumes whatever is thrown into it and becomes stronger from the material itself. Hermeticism teaches something similar. Every emotional state contains hidden energy. Anger contains intensity. Fear contains alertness. Grief contains depth. Desire contains movement. The initiate learns to separate the raw energy from the destructive interpretation attached to it. That changes everything. A man loses his position after 20 years of work. One version of him collapses internally and concludes his life is ending. Another version experiences the same pain but uses it differently. The shock awakens him. He begins studying, rebuilding, adapting, questioning his identity beyond status. 5 years later, the event he once feared becomes the doorway to an entirely different life. Same event. Different transmutation. That is hermetic power. There is a dangerous misunderstanding in modern spiritual culture that emotions should simply be positive. Ancient systems never taught that. They taught mastery, not avoidance. Suppressed emotions become distortion. Redirected emotions become intelligence. Even the ancient alchemists encoded this symbolically. In many drawings, dragons guarded treasure. The dragon represented untamed instinct, fear, chaos, and emotional force. The treasure represented consciousness refined through discipline. The initiate was not meant to kill the dragon. He was meant to master it. Carl Jung later echoed this ancient principle when he warned that what remains unconscious controls human behavior from beneath awareness. The Hermetic initiate understood this centuries earlier. Emotional energy denied becomes shadow. Emotional energy understood becomes power. A monk from the eastern deserts once described anger as a horse with enormous strength but no rider. Untamed, it destroys. Directed, it carries a man across impossible distances. The same applies to fear. Fear is not always weakness. Sometimes fear is simply energy awaiting instruction. Before a battle, ancient warriors often trembled. Before great speeches, philosophers felt nervousness. Before transformation, nearly every human experiences uncertainty. The difference is interpretation. One person calls fear proof of failure. Another calls it proof that something meaningful is happening. Meaning changes energy. Energy changes behavior. Behavior changes destiny. That is why the Hermetic masters guarded interpretation so carefully. There is another forgotten layer to mental transmutation. The body itself responds to consciousness. Emotional states alter breathing, muscle tension, posture, hormonal balance, facial expression, and perception speed. Ancient initiates understood this intuitively long before neuroscience confirmed it scientifically. They knew that emotional mastery was not abstract philosophy. It was biological influence. A frightened mind weakens the body, a disciplined mind strengthens it. That is why ancient schools trained breathing, posture, silence, fasting, and concentration together. Consciousness and physiology were never viewed as separate systems. The inner and outer reflected one another continuously. As within, so without. A merchant once visited a desert mystic and complained that his life was cursed. Every partnership failed. Every opportunity disappeared. Every relationship collapsed into conflict. The mystic listened quietly before asking one question: "What emotion do you practice most often?" The merchant was confused. "Practice?" he asked. "Yes," the mystic replied. "Because repeated emotion becomes character. Character becomes behavior. Behavior becomes fate." Silence filled the room. The merchant slowly realized that suspicion ruled his entire life. He distrusted everyone, expected betrayal everywhere, interpreted neutral events negatively. His fear had become projection, and projection had become reality. Many people call this coincidence. Ancient wisdom called it correspondence. Mental transmutation begins the moment a person becomes aware of the emotional atmosphere they repeatedly generate within themselves, because repeated internal states become familiar identities. And familiar identities unconsciously recreate familiar outcomes. This is why awareness alone is transformative. The moment you observe fear clearly without surrendering to it, you weaken its automatic control. The moment you redirect anger into disciplined movement, you alter its effect. The moment you convert confusion into curiosity, consciousness expands instead of contracts. Tiny shifts, massive consequences. A Buddhist teacher once compared the mind to a cup of muddy water. Shake it constantly and it remains clouded. Let it settle and clarity naturally appears. Ancient Hermeticism taught the same truth differently. Emotional turbulence distorts perception. Stillness restores sight. That is why the initiates valued silence so deeply. Not because silence was empty, but because silence exposed hidden mental patterns. Most people fear silence because silence reveals what distraction conceals. And once revealed, transformation becomes possible. Mental transmutation is not mystical fantasy. It is the disciplined redirection of consciousness. It is the refusal to become a prisoner of emotional momentum. It is the realization that awareness can intervene before reaction becomes identity. This is the hidden threshold between ordinary life and conscious life. One life is ruled by emotional habit, the other is guided by deliberate perception. The ancient initiates understood that reality does not merely happen to human beings. Human beings participate in shaping their experience through the quality of consciousness they repeatedly embody. That realization changes the meaning of power entirely, not domination over others, mastery within yourself, and from that inner mastery, an entirely different reality begins to emerge. A dried emotion consciously. Alchemy begins there. Chapter 6. Gnosticism and the Prison of Illusion. Imagine waking inside a vast prison without realizing it is a prison. The walls are invisible. The chains feel normal. The routines appear natural. Everyone around you behaves as though nothing is wrong. Yet beneath the surface, something feels incomplete, a quiet sense that reality is not what it appears to be. This was the unsettling realization at the heart of ancient Gnosticism, one of the most mysterious spiritual traditions ever discovered. When the Nag Hammadi texts were uncovered in Egypt in 1945, scholars found writings buried for centuries beneath the desert sands. These texts spoke of hidden knowledge, inner awakening, and humanity's spiritual amnesia. The Gnostics believed that most human beings lived trapped inside illusion, not merely political illusion or social illusion, but existential illusion. a false identity mistaken for the true self. And according to these teachings, the prison was not physical walls, it was unconsciousness itself. The Gnostics taught that human beings become hypnotized by appearances: wealth, status, approval, fear, conflict, endless desire. These forces pull awareness outward until people forget the deeper essence within themselves. They begin identifying completely with temporary roles and emotional patterns. The mask becomes mistaken for the soul. This was called sleep. One Gnostic teacher described humanity as drunk without wine, wandering through life in a state of psychological forgetfulness. Most people never stop long enough to ask who is actually thinking their thoughts, fearing their fears, chasing their ambitions. They inherit identities from family, culture, trauma, and social conditioning without ever questioning them. And whatever remains unquestioned begins controlling reality from beneath awareness. An ancient parable tells of a prince raised among beggars after being separated from his royal family as a child. For years he lived believing he was poor, weak, and insignificant because everyone around him treated him that way. One day a traveler arrived carrying a sealed letter from the kingdom. Inside was the truth of his identity. Nothing external changed instantly. The streets remained the same. The clothes remained the same. Yet the prince himself transformed because perception transformed. He no longer interpreted reality through limitation. He remembered who he was. The Gnostics believed awakening worked similarly, not acquiring something new, remembering what had been forgotten. This is why hidden knowledge was considered dangerous. Not because it granted supernatural powers in the fantasy sense, but because it shattered psychological obedience. A person who sees clearly becomes difficult to manipulate. Fear loses some of its grip. Social hypnosis weakens. Material obsession begins losing its authority over the mind. The awakened person still lives in the world, but no longer belongs entirely to its illusions. That distinction matters deeply. Modern life constantly reinforces external identity. People are taught to measure themselves through comparison, productivity, appearance, possessions, and approval. Entire systems profit from insecurity because insecure people are easier to control. A mind constantly distracted by deficiency rarely discovers its deeper nature. The Gnostics warned about this long ago. They believed the false self survives through endless attachment and unconscious repetition. The ego becomes addicted to external validation because it fears emptiness. Yet ironically, the more external identity expands, the more inner disconnection grows. This is why some wealthy individuals remain internally miserable while some outwardly simple individuals radiate peace. One has accumulated possessions without awakening. The other has cultivated awareness beyond possessions, different forms of wealth. A traveler once visited an old mystic living alone near the edge of a desert village. The traveler was shocked by the simplicity of the man's home. There were almost no belongings inside. Confused, the traveler asked, "Where are your possessions?" The mystic smiled gently and replied, "Where are yours?" The traveler laughed nervously. "I'm only passing through." "So am I," the mystic answered. Few sentences capture the Gnostic spirit more clearly. The material world itself was not necessarily evil in these traditions. The danger was unconscious attachment to it, mistaking temporary structures for ultimate identity, building an entire existence around things that inevitably change. Because everything external changes, bodies age, doticity shifts, money moves, relationships evolve. Civilizations rise and fall, yet awareness itself, The witnessing consciousness beneath experience remains strangely constant throughout life. The Gnostics believed reconnecting with that deeper awareness was the beginning of liberation, not escape from reality, freedom within it. This inner awakening changes perception dramatically. A person begins noticing how emotional reactions shape experience. They observe how fear distorts interpretation. They recognize how inherited beliefs silently organize behavior. They see how society rewards distraction while discouraging self-awareness. And once seen clearly, the illusion weakens. A Buddhist master once compared awakening to realizing a rope mistaken for a snake was never dangerous in the first place. Fear dissolves the moment perception becomes accurate. The external object may remain unchanged, but consciousness transforms completely. The Gnostics taught something similar. Much of human suffering comes not from reality itself, but from false identification with mental constructs about reality. That realization is uncomfortable at first because it demands responsibility. If perception influences experience, then unconscious patterns matter enormously. Blame becomes more difficult. Awareness becomes unavoidable, but hidden within that responsibility is freedom, because what can be observed can also be transformed. This is why ancient awakening traditions emphasized self-inquiry so intensely. They were not trying to create passive believers. They were trying to awaken conscious observers. The prison weakens the moment awareness enters it. Question inherited beliefs about reality. Liberation begins there. Chapter 7. Stoic Logos and Universal Order. A Roman emperor once sat alone in a dim military tent while rain hammered against worn leather above his head. Beyond the tent walls, thousands of soldiers waited in sickness, fear, and exhaustion as war consumed the frontier. Messengers carried news of plague through the empire. Crops were failing. Betrayal moved silently through political halls. Yet inside that small candlelit shelter, Marcus Aurelius wrote words that survived centuries. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Most people read that sentence as motivational philosophy. The Stoics understood it as survival wisdom, a sacred law. Emotional chaos distorts perception before reality itself can wound you. The Stoics believed existence was guided by something they called logos, a rational intelligence beneath visible life. Not a distant god judging humanity from above, but an ordering principle woven through nature itself. The seasons obeyed it, stars moved through it, rivers flowed according to it. Human consciousness either aligned with this hidden order or resisted it through emotional confusion. The Stoics taught that suffering often begins when the mind rebels against what already exists. Resistance creates distortion. Distortion creates blindness. Ancient teachers compared consciousness to water reflecting the moon. When water is still, reflection becomes clear. When disturbed, even the brightest moon appears broken. The moon never changed, only the surface did. So it is with perception. Many people believe fear comes from reality itself, but Stoicism quietly argues something more unsettling. Fear often comes from interpretation before fact. One man loses money and sees destruction. Another loses money and sees instruction. Same event, different reality, different energy, different future. The philosopher Epictetus understood this deeply because he lived as a slave before becoming one of history's greatest teachers. One story claims his master twisted his leg violently, while Epictetus calmly warned him, "You will break it." The master continued until the bone snapped. Epictetus simply replied, "Did I not tell you?" Whether fully historical or symbolic, the story survived because it represented Stoic inner discipline. The body could be harmed. Circumstances could become brutal, but interpretation remained sovereign. That frightened rulers. Inner freedom cannot be chained. The modern world rarely teaches this distinction. Instead, people are conditioned to emotionally fuse with every external fluctuation. News becomes identity, conflict becomes personality, attention becomes captivity. A stranger's opinion ruins entire days. One failure becomes a permanent self-concept. Stoicism warned against this thousands of years ago. Emotional impulsiveness fragments consciousness. Fragmented consciousness loses clarity, and clarity is power. The ancients understood something modern people forget. Reaction drains life force faster than hardship itself. Observe exhausted people closely. Often it is not labor destroying them, it is resistance, internal argument, endless emotional narration. The mind keeps replaying events long after reality has moved on. This creates energetic friction. Stoics called this unnecessary suffering. Buddhists would later echo similar truths through attachment and mental identification. Different traditions, same hidden law. There is an old story of a Stoic teacher walking with students through a crowded Athenian marketplace. Merchants shouted, citizens argued, beggars pulled at robes, musicians played loudly beside political speakers. One student finally asked the teacher, "Master, how do we find peace in such noise?" The teacher smiled and brought them beside a fountain. He dropped a pebble into the water. Ripples spread outward. "The disturbance is not the problem," he said softly. "The problem is becoming the ripple." The students stood silently. Some lessons enter the mind slowly, others arrive like lightning. This is why Stoic training focused heavily on pause and observation. Before reacting emotionally, initiates were taught to create distance between event and interpretation. A tiny space, just enough to regain conscious choice. In that pause, perception reorganizes itself. Anger weakens, fear loses momentum, clarity returns. This was not emotional suppression. Stoics did not deny feeling. They denied emotional slavery. Modern psychology now observes similar mechanisms. People who repeatedly react impulsively strengthen neurological pathways tied to fear and stress. Emotional repetition becomes identity. Ancient Stoics understood this intuitively long before laboratories existed. They trained mental resilience the way warriors trained the body, daily, deliberately, ruthlessly. One Stoic exercise involved imagining loss before it occurred, wealth disappearing, reputation collapsing, loved ones leaving, not to become pessimistic, but to dissolve unconscious dependence. The goal was liberation from emotional fragility. When fear is faced consciously, its control weakens. Hidden fear grows strongest in avoidance. Seen clearly, it begins dissolving. There is immense power in this realization. Most external chaos first enters through interpretation. The mind stamps meaning onto experience instantly, often unconsciously. Someone ignores your message. Instantly the mind invents rejection. A business slows down. Instantly catastrophe appears internally. Yet these meanings are rarely reality itself. They are assumptions wearing emotional clothing. The Stoics believed disciplined perception aligned humans with logos, the intelligent harmony beneath life. Emotional excess separated people from this harmony. Inner stillness restored it. This is why ancient sages appeared calm during crisis, not because they lacked emotion, but because they understood emotional storms distort vision. A sailor navigating violent seas cannot control the ocean. But panic guarantees destruction, clarity creates survival. The same principle governs consciousness. Short sentence, stillness sharpens perception. The deeper mystery is this. People become what they repeatedly rehearse emotionally. A fearful mind begins scanning for evidence of danger everywhere. An angry mind finds insult in ordinary conversation. A grateful mind notices opportunity others overlook completely. Perception organizes reality experience, not magically, structurally. This is why ancient traditions treated attention like sacred fire. Whatever consciousness feeds grows stronger internally. Stoics knew this, Hermetic initiates knew this, Buddhist monks knew this. Modern society forgets it hourly. The practical discipline begins simply. Before reacting emotionally, pause. Observe the first interpretation arising within you. Ask quietly, is this reality or my conditioned perception of reality? That single question interrupts unconscious momentum. It returns authority to awareness itself. Action. Pause before emotional reaction, because the person who governs reaction eventually governs destiny. Chapter 8. Why most people drain their energy. Imagine a man waking before sunrise already exhausted, not from labor, not from hunger, but from invisible fragmentation. Before his feet touch the floor, his attention has already been divided into dozens of directions, messages, notifications, worries, regrets, predictions, comparison, noise. His body is alive, yet his consciousness is scattered across hundreds of unfinished mental movements. Ancient teachers would have recognized this condition instantly. They would not call it stress. They would call it energetic leakage. Most people believe energy disappears through physical effort alone. Ancient systems taught something far more profound. Energy drains wherever attention is unconsciously consumed. A distracted mind becomes a weakened mind. A weakened mind loses clarity, and without clarity, perception collapses into reaction. Centuries ago, deep within isolated monasteries hidden among mountains and deserts, initiates underwent brutal concentration training. Some Buddhist monks stared at candle flames for hours without movement. Hermetic students memorized sacred passages while resisting distraction. Sufi mystics repeated divine names rhythmically until stray thought dissolved into still awareness. The goal was never mere discipline. The goal was energetic unification. A focused consciousness becomes powerful because it stops leaking itself into chaos. Modern civilization moves in the opposite direction. The average person now consumes more information in a single day than ancient villagers encountered in months. Minds are overstimulated but underdirected. Constant input creates internal static. People mistake stimulation for vitality while secretly becoming psychologically exhausted. There is an old parable from the desert fathers of early mystic traditions. A young seeker approached an elder monk and complained, "Master, my mind feels weak and restless. I cannot hear truth anymore." The elder handed him a bowl filled with water and ash mixed together. "Drink," he said. The student grimaced. "It is clouded." The elder nodded. "Then stop shaking the bowl." Wisdom rarely arrives dramatically. Often it appears in silence. Modern people continuously shake the bowl. One moment they obsess over financial fear. Next they compare themselves to strangers. Then political outrage floods the mind. Then endless entertainment fragments attention further. By evening, consciousness becomes crowded with emotional residue that was never processed or released. Ancient initiates protected their minds the way kings protected treasure vaults. Today, people surrender attention freely to anything demanding emotional reaction, and here lies the hidden danger. What repeatedly captures attention slowly shapes identity. A fearful person watches fearful narratives daily and begins unconsciously expecting catastrophe. An angry person feeds endlessly on outrage and gradually perceives enemies everywhere. Attention conditions emotional atmosphere. Emotional atmosphere shapes behavior. Behavior influences destiny. This is why many people feel strangely powerless despite having more conveniences than any civilization before them. Their consciousness is overloaded yet directionless. Ancient traditions warned repeatedly that scattered awareness weakens spiritual perception. Even physical exhaustion becomes heavier when consciousness is fragmented. The Renaissance occult philosopher Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa wrote extensively about hidden correspondences between mind, emotion, and natural forces. He believed human beings radiated subtle influence through thought and intention. Whether interpreted mystically or psychologically, the principle remains strikingly relevant. Sustained attention alters internal reality first, and internal reality eventually influences external behavior, relationships, and opportunities. Observe highly focused individuals carefully. They move differently, speak differently. Even their presence feels concentrated. Ancient martial traditions understood this deeply. Warriors trained not merely to strengthen the body, but to stabilize attention under pressure. Panic scatters energy. Focus condenses it. Short sentence, attention is invisible power. There is also a quieter form of energy drain few recognize: unresolved emotional loops, replaying old conversations, imagining future disasters repeatedly, mentally fighting battles that no longer exist. The body reacts chemically to imagined threats almost as strongly as real ones. Ancient Stoics warned against this internal warfare constantly. Buddhists described it as attachment to mental formations, different language, same prison. One Zen teacher was once asked why monks practiced sweeping temple floors every single day, even when they were already clean. The teacher answered, "Because dust returns daily." The mind works similarly. Clarity requires maintenance, attention requires protection, inner order requires renewal. This does not mean abandoning responsibility or withdrawing from life. Ancient wisdom never demanded escape from reality. It demanded conscious participation within it. The problem is not work. The problem is unconscious fragmentation. A focused laborer may preserve more energy than a distracted person lying in bed all day. The practical discipline begins with reclaiming attention deliberately. Reduce unnecessary stimulation. Observe what repeatedly hijacks emotional focus. Limit compulsive information consumption. Spend moments daily in silence without external input. Even 5 minutes of intentional stillness begins reorganizing scattered awareness. Action: reclaim mental focus intentionally, because whatever controls your attention eventually begins controlling your inner world. Chapter 9. The Kybalion and the Law of Polarity. A man once stood trembling outside the gates of battle, while another walked calmly beside him, wearing the same armor, hearing the same war drums, facing the same danger. One felt paralyzed, the other felt sharpened. Yet both men were experiencing the same force moving through them. The ancient Hermetic initiates would have said the difference was not the absence of fear, but the transformation of fear into courage through consciousness. This was the hidden meaning behind the Kybalion's principle of polarity. Opposites are not separate realities, but different degrees of the same energy. Heat and cold are variations of temperature. Darkness and light are variations of illumination. Likewise, fear and courage are not enemies. They are movements along the same emotional spectrum. Most people misunderstand emotional mastery because they attempt violent internal resistance. They try to destroy fear instantly. They try to force positivity while secretly drowning in anxiety beneath the surface. But the Hermetic masters taught something subtler and far more powerful. Emotions are not conquered through suppression. They are transmuted through gradual movement. Shift gradually. That was the ancient method. Imagine a freezing room. No person removes cold by attacking it directly. They introduce warmth slowly until the temperature changes naturally. The same principle applies to consciousness. A fearful mind cannot leap instantly into absolute confidence, but it can move from panic to stability, stability to clarity, clarity to trust. Emotional transmutation happens through degrees. An old Hermetic story speaks of an initiate brought before a chamber filled with mirrors and firelight beneath an Egyptian temple. The initiate expected mystical visions or divine beings. Instead, the teacher placed a serpent into the chamber. Terrified, the young man stumbled backward in panic. The teacher asked calmly, "What controls you now?" The initiate answered, "Fear." The teacher nodded and said, "Then fear is your master." For months the initiate returned daily to the chamber. At first he trembled, later he observed. Eventually he stood calmly in the serpent's presence without emotional collapse. The serpent had not changed. Consciousness had. This was mental alchemy, not fantasy, not denial, transformation through disciplined awareness. The principle of polarity reveals why human beings often remain trapped inside emotional extremes. They mistakenly believe emotions are fixed identities rather than movable conditions. A person says, "I am anxious," instead of recognizing anxiety as a temporary energetic state capable of transformation. Identity fuses with emotion. The prison forms instantly. The Stoics understood this deeply. Epictetus taught that suffering does not arise from events themselves, but from judgments about those events. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself during war and plague that emotional reaction could either enslave the mind or strengthen it. These philosophers were not emotionally numb. They were emotionally disciplined. They learned how to stand between stimulus and reaction. That pause changed everything. A merchant insulted by a rival can react with rage and destroy years of relationships in one evening. Another man hears the same insult, pauses internally, and responds with composure. Same event, different polarity. One becomes consumed by anger. The other converts anger into measured action. Ancient initiates trained this skill deliberately because they believed uncontrolled emotion weakened perception itself. Fear narrowed awareness. Rage distorted judgment. Despair blinded possibility. But balanced emotional states sharpened intuition and increased clarity. Emotional mastery, therefore, became a sacred science of perception. Fear and courage are connected energetically. Modern psychology quietly confirms this ancient insight. Physiologically, fear and excitement produce remarkably similar bodily responses: increased heartbeat, heightened alertness, adrenaline activation. The body often generates similar energy, yet the mind interprets it differently. One interpretation becomes paralysis, another becomes focused readiness. The interpretation changes the experience. This is why elite warriors throughout history trained not merely physically, but psychologically. Samurai practiced meditation before combat. Stoics rehearsed hardship mentally before encountering it physically. Sufi mystics confronted egoic fear through surrender and remembrance. Buddhist monks observed emotional states without attachment. Different traditions, same underlying principle: inner extremes can be governed. The Kybalion described this process as raising vibration through conscious mental movement. Lower emotional states such as hatred, panic, envy, and despair were not seen as moral failures alone, but as denser mental conditions limiting perception. Higher states such as clarity, discipline, compassion, and courage expanded awareness. The initiate's task was not perfection. It was conscious elevation. A woman grieving loss may initially collapse into emptiness, but gradually she begins noticing small moments of gratitude, then moments of meaning, then strength she did not know existed. Grief slowly transforms into wisdom, pain becomes depth, suffering becomes understanding. The emotional energy changes form rather than disappearing entirely. Form, not force. The ancients knew forced emotional denial creates fragmentation. A person pretending to feel peace while internally drowning in resentment eventually fractures psychologically. Real transmutation requires honest awareness first. One cannot transform what one refuses to acknowledge. This is why ancient temple schools emphasized self-observation so intensely. Initiates recorded reactions carefully. What triggers fear? What strengthens envy? What creates emotional collapse? What restores balance? Awareness itself weakened unconscious emotional control. A powerful example appears in the teachings of Aristotle, who believed virtue developed gradually through repeated action. No individual becomes courageous instantly. Courage develops through consistent practice of disciplined behavior under difficulty. Emotional mastery, therefore, is trained like a muscle. Repeated small victories reorganize character over time. This ancient wisdom becomes painfully relevant in modern life, where emotional extremes are constantly amplified. News cycles monetize outrage. Algorithms reward emotional volatility. Social media encourages comparison, envy, anger, fear, and impulsive reaction. Human attention is manipulated through emotional stimulation because reactive people are easier to influence. An emotionally reactive mind loses sovereignty. Ancient Hermetic initiates would likely see the modern world as a battlefield of uncontrolled polarity. People swing violently between hope and despair, obsession and exhaustion, confidence and insecurity. Few are taught how to stabilize internally. Fewer still understand emotional movement consciously, yet polarity contains hidden hope. Because if fear and courage belong to the same spectrum, movement remains possible, no darkness remains permanent, no despair remains fixed, no emotional state remains absolute. The pendulum can shift. A young monk once asked his teacher, "How do I remove fear from my mind?" The old teacher smiled gently and replied, "Do not fight the darkness directly. Open the window." That was the wisdom of polarity. The absence of courage is not defeated by force, but transformed through gradual illumination. Small shifts matter enormously. A fearful person speaks honestly once. A grieving person chooses meaning once. An angry person pauses once instead of exploding. A hopeless person continues one more day. Tiny movements alter emotional direction, and direction eventually becomes destiny. The Hermetic masters understood that emotional transmutation was not only spiritual but practical. Relationships improved when resentment transformed into understanding. Leadership strengthened when fear transformed into composure. Creativity expanded when self-doubt transformed into curiosity. Entire lives reorganized through inner shifts invisible to outsiders. Master your inner extremes, that was the hidden teaching, because a person ruled entirely by emotional polarity becomes unstable, manipulated by every external condition. But a person who understands polarity learns to navigate emotional states consciously rather than drowning inside them. The true initiate was not emotionless. The true initiate became emotionally sovereign. And once sovereignty emerges internally, reality itself begins appearing differently. Challenges become training, fear becomes information, pain becomes refinement, obstacles become teachers. The energy never disappears. It transforms. Chapter 10. The modern war for attention. A monk living in silence inside a mountain monastery once spent 10 years learning to hold his attention on a single candle flame without distraction. Modern humanity struggles to hold attention on a sentence for more than a few seconds. That contrast alone reveals one of the greatest hidden crises of the modern age. Ancient civilizations understood attention as sacred power. Modern systems treat it as a commodity to capture, fragment, and sell. Attention is energetic currency. Whatever consistently holds your attention eventually shapes your emotional state, perception, identity, and behavior. The ancients understood this long before algorithms existed. Hermetic teachers guarded mental environments carefully because they knew consciousness becomes shaped by repeated focus. What you repeatedly observe, emotionally absorb, and mentally rehearse gradually becomes part of your inner architecture. Today, the average human mind is under constant assault. Notifications interrupt silence. Endless information floods awareness. Emotional stimulation arrives every minute through screens designed specifically to hijack attention. Fear spreads faster than reflection. Outrage spreads faster than wisdom. Comparison spreads faster than gratitude. The result is internal fragmentation, and fragmented consciousness becomes weak. An old Buddhist teaching compares the uncontrolled mind to a monkey leaping wildly from branch to branch without rest. Modern life has turned that monkey into a storm. Most people no longer direct attention consciously. Their attention is pulled externally by every noise, trend, crisis, and emotional trigger surrounding them. The cost is enormous. Scattered attention weakens identity itself because identity forms through repeated mental focus over time. A person constantly distracted loses clarity about values, purpose, emotional direction, and inner stability. Ancient initiates understood that concentration was not merely productivity, it was power. Focus is power. This is why silence practices existed across nearly every wisdom tradition. Christian monks retreated into deserts. Sufi mystics practiced solitude and remembrance. Buddhist monks meditated for hours daily. Hermetic initiates entered isolated chambers beneath temples. Taoist sages disappeared into mountains. Silence was never escape. Silence was calibration. Without silence, consciousness becomes drowned by external influence. A story from ancient Alexandria tells of a young student who begged a hermetic teacher to reveal the secrets of higher knowledge. Instead of answering, the teacher took the student to a crowded marketplace. Merchants shouted, animals screamed, coins clattered, arguments erupted from every direction. The teacher asked, "Can you hear the flute?" Confused, the student listened carefully and finally heard faint music hidden beneath the chaos. The teacher smiled at his mouth and said, "Wisdom is like that." The distracted mind cannot perceive subtle truth. Modern overstimulation creates spiritual numbness. People become so accustomed to constant noise that stillness itself feels uncomfortable. Silence begins exposing unresolved thoughts, fears, insecurities, and emotional exhaustion. So distraction can become emotional anesthesia. But the ancient teachers warned that endless distraction eventually weakens perception itself. A distracted person cannot observe deeply, cannot reflect deeply, cannot feel deeply, cannot understand deeply. Superficial attention creates superficial awareness. This is why modern people often feel strangely exhausted despite doing very little physically demanding work. Mental fragmentation drains energy continuously. Every unresolved notification, emotional trigger, comparison cycle, and information overload pulls consciousness into pieces. The result is inner chaos. And inner chaos eventually appears externally through indecision, anxiety, emotional reactivity, weakened relationships, and loss of purpose. Ancient concentration training worked differently. Initiates practiced holding awareness deliberately on symbols, prayers, breathing patterns, philosophical reflections, or natural elements for long periods. This strengthened mental stability the way physical training strengthens the body. Attention became disciplined instead of reactive. The modern world profits from your distraction. That is the uncomfortable truth. A focused individual becomes difficult to manipulate because clarity increases discernment. A distracted individual reacts impulsively, consumes endlessly, and rarely questions deeply. Ancient wisdom traditions understood that control over attention was closely connected to freedom itself. Whoever governs your attention influences your reality. This is why protecting attention has become one of the most important spiritual disciplines of modern life. Not out of fear, out of necessity. Protect your inner environment carefully. Choose what enters consciousness repeatedly. Reduce unnecessary stimulation. Practice moments of intentional silence. Observe how different environments affect emotional energy. Small shifts restore power. Even 5 minutes of undistracted stillness daily begins reorganizing awareness. The nervous system calms. Perception sharpens, emotional reactions slow down, clarity quietly returns. Stillness restores intelligence, and in a world constantly demanding your attention, the ability to direct consciousness deliberately may become one of the rarest forms of power left. Chapter 11. Energy, Identity, and Reality. There is an ancient Sufi story about a traveler who crossed 3 deserts searching for a hidden master said to possess the science of inner transformation. The man believed the teacher would reveal secret rituals capable of changing destiny overnight. When he finally arrived at the old sanctuary carved into the mountains, the master did not greet him with prophecy or mystical ceremony. Instead, he handed him a cracked bronze mirror. The traveler stared at it in confusion. The master asked quietly, "What do you see, myself?" The traveler answered. The old man shook his head slowly. "No, you see the identity you repeat." The traveler did not understand. For days he waited for sacred instruction. Instead, the master observed him silently. He noticed how the traveler apologized before speaking, doubted his own decisions, compared himself constantly to others, and expected rejection before connection. Finally, the master said something the traveler never forgot. "Your life obeys the image you secretly worship." That sentence haunted him more deeply than any ritual. Most people imagine identity as a collection of facts: age, profession, history, personality. Ancient traditions understood identity differently. Hermetic initiates, Buddhist monks, Stoic philosophers, and even Renaissance alchemists believed identity was energetic orientation, a repeated internal state shaping perception, behavior, and emotional vibration. Who you believe yourself to be quietly determines what you notice, what you tolerate, what you pursue, and what you unconsciously reject. Invisible architecture. A man who believes he is powerless interprets challenge as threat. Another man facing the same event interprets it as opportunity. One collapses emotionally, the other sharpens inwardly. The external condition may be identical, yet the internal identity transforms the experience entirely. This is why ancient Hermetic teachings insisted reality reflects dominant consciousness. Not because the world magically rearranges itself instantly, but because identity organizes perception like a hidden lens over existence itself. The Kybalion hinted at this mystery when describing vibration and mental transmutation. Sustained inner states create consistent energetic patterns. Those patterns influence action, emotional reactions, posture, decisions, speech, relationships, and attention. Eventually, these repeated internal movements solidify into what people call reality. Identity becomes atmosphere, and atmosphere shapes destiny. A modern man may say, "I want confidence," while emotionally identifying as inadequate every single day. Another says he desires peace while internally addicted to chaos and urgency. A woman may seek love while unconsciously believing abandonment is inevitable. The conscious mind requests one reality while the deeper identity projects another. Ancient initiates knew this contradiction well. In certain Egyptian mystery schools, students were reportedly isolated in dark temple chambers for long periods of reflection. This was not punishment, it was confrontation. Without distraction, identity reveals itself. Fear surfaces. Emotional patterns become visible. The initiate begins observing the invisible assumptions ruling perception, because the deepest prison is unconscious identity. A Buddhist teacher once described the mind as a painter trapped inside its own painting. The painter forgets it created the image and then becomes terrified by what it sees. This is how emotional identity operates. Repeated feelings harden into expectations. Expectations influence interpretation. Interpretation shapes action. Action reinforces identity again. The cycle repeats endlessly. A man rejected repeatedly in childhood may unconsciously carry humiliation into adulthood. Without realizing it, he interprets neutral interactions negatively. He hesitates during opportunities. He withdraws emotionally before others can reject him. Eventually, his fears seem proven by experience. Even though his identity quietly helped create the pattern, the outer world reflected the inner script. Hermetic philosophy calls this correspondence as within, so without. Not punishment structure, this principle appears across nearly every wisdom tradition. Aristotle believed repeated actions become character. Stoics believed perception shapes suffering. Sufis believed the ego creates separation from truth. Buddhists taught attachment and identification generate illusion. Gnostics warned humanity had forgotten its true spiritual nature beneath conditioned identity. Different languages, same law. Identity directs awareness unconsciously. There is a reason confident people often notice opportunities others ignore. It is not always intelligence or luck. Their internal state expands perception itself. Fear narrows awareness while confidence broadens it. One mind searches for danger, another searches for possibility. Energy follows identity, and identity follows repetition. This is why emotional habits matter so deeply. Most people do not realize how often they rehearse limitation internally. They imagine worst-case scenarios repeatedly. They emotionally relive humiliation. They anticipate failure before action. Over time, these mental rehearsals become emotional frequencies continuously shaping perception. The body begins obeying the story, the voice changes, behavior changes, attention changes, life changes. A Stoic philosopher might call this lack of inner governance. A Hermetic initiate would call it unconscious vibration. Modern psychology calls it conditioning. Yet the underlying insight remains remarkably similar. Sustained internal states influence external experience. Ancient wisdom never taught passive fantasy detached from action. That is modern distortion. True transformation required disciplined embodiment. The initiate became the state before seeking the result. This was the hidden meaning behind many ancient rites. A young student entering a temple was not simply learning information. He was learning to inhabit a different consciousness. Controlled breathing, silence disciplines, concentrated attention, symbolic meditation, emotional restraint. These practices were designed to reshape identity itself, because action without identity collapses under pressure, but identity-supported action becomes natural. Consider a king walking into a room. He does not force himself to feel royal. His posture, speech, attention, and decisions emerge from identity automatically. Likewise, someone deeply identified with weakness unconsciously expresses fear through body language, hesitation, and emotional interpretation. Identity radiates silently, even environments begin reflecting it. There is an old saying among desert mystics: "The world listens to what you repeatedly believe." Most people underestimate this completely. They attempt to change outcomes without changing energetic orientation. They chase new circumstances while preserving the same fearful identity, generating old patterns. That is why temporary motivation fades so quickly. Without identity transformation, behavior eventually returns to familiar emotional territory. A man can force confidence temporarily, but if he still identifies as powerless internally, pressure will eventually expose the deeper belief. Ancient Hermetic teachings therefore emphasized inner mastery before external influence. The initiate first learned self-observation. He became aware of recurring emotional states. He studied the hidden movements of attention. He recognized how assumptions shaped interpretation. Awareness came first. Transformation followed naturally afterward. There is another little-known story from the teachings surrounding Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher. One of his students asked why enlightenment seemed so distant despite years of study. Plotinus reportedly answered, "You are trying to become what you already are beneath confusion." Profound words. Most transformation is not acquisition. It is remembrance, the removal of distortion, the uncovering of buried consciousness beneath fear-conditioned identity. This is why stillness is so powerful. In silence, people encounter the repetitive emotional atmosphere they usually escape through distraction. They begin hearing the hidden voice shaping their lives. "I am not enough. Nothing changes. I always fail. People cannot be trusted." These repeated internal declarations become energetic commands, and reality slowly organizes around them, not magically, psychologically, behaviorally, energetically, socially, spiritually. The ancient masters understood human consciousness more deeply than modern society often admits. They knew perception is not passive observation, but active participation. Identity is not fixed structure, but living vibration continuously reinforced through attention and emotion. Chant the dominant state, and reality begins shifting accordingly, slowly at first, then dramatically. A fearful person entering conflict searches for attack. A centered person entering the same conflict searches for understanding. A hopeless mind sees closed doors. A disciplined mind sees hidden openings. Two realities emerge from one circumstance. This is the hidden relationship between energy, identity, and reality. The world reflects not only actions, but the consciousness behind actions. And perhaps this explains why some people walk through chaos while preserving inner clarity. They are no longer emotionally hypnotized by appearances. Their identity no longer depends entirely on external conditions. They carry stability inwardly first. That stability influences perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior influences destiny. The ancient alchemists described this process symbolically as turning lead into gold. Modern minds often interpret this literally or materially, but many initiates understood the deeper meaning. transforming dense emotional states into awakened consciousness, fear into awareness, confusion into insight, reaction into mastery. The outer world changes when the inner interpreter changes. That is the real transmutation, and the first step is brutally simple. Observe who you repeatedly become emotionally, because identity is not what you say occasionally. Identity is what you rehearse daily action. Embody desired identity emotionally, not through fantasy, through repetition, through awareness, through disciplined internal alignment. Because eventually, reality begins responding to the state you sustain most consistently. Chapter 12. Why reality reflects your dominant state. A desert healer once traveled village to village carrying no medicine except water, herbs, and conversation. People called him strange because sometimes he healed the suffering without touching them at all. One evening, a grieving father asked him how such things were possible. The old healer pointed toward two gardens standing beside one another near the edge of the village. One was dry, neglected, and collapsing beneath weeds. The other overflowed with figs, flowers, and vibrant green life. They drink from the same rain, the healer whispered, but not from the same condition. Then he walked away. Most people spend their lives studying circumstances while ignoring condition. Ancient philosophies repeatedly warned that sustained emotional atmosphere quietly shapes perception, interpretation, and behavior. Over time, this dominant state begins influencing the quality of decisions, relationships, opportunities, and even physical vitality. Reality reflects your dominant state because perception itself is never neutral. Every mind filters existence emotionally. A fearful person entering a room unconsciously searches for danger. Tone of voice becomes threat, silence becomes rejection, uncertainty becomes catastrophe. Fear narrows awareness like a tunnel. It filters reality selectively until the world begins appearing hostile everywhere. The terrifying part is that the person often believes they are simply seeing truth, but they are seeing through emotional conditioning. The Buddha taught that suffering is intensified not merely by events themselves, but by attachment and mental interpretation. Two people may experience identical loss while responding entirely differently internally. One becomes consumed by bitterness, the other becomes wiser, softer, and more awake. Same event, different state. Different reality. Ancient Hermetic teachings described this through vibration. Sustained emotional states radiate outward psychologically and behaviorally, influencing interaction with life itself. Fear creates defensive decisions. Chronic anger attracts conflict. Desperation clouds judgment. Calmness sharpens perception. Gratitude expands emotional resilience. Emotional atmosphere becomes invisible architecture. There is a reason exhausted people begin noticing more problems everywhere. Their nervous system conditions perception toward threat. Likewise, deeply hopeful people often discover opportunities invisible to others. Their state broadens awareness instead of collapsing it. Energy organizes attention. Attention organizes reality. Modern society rarely teaches this directly. Instead, people are conditioned to believe external achievement alone creates emotional stability. But ancient wisdom traditions inverted this understanding. They believed stable inner states produced clearer action externally. Inner climate first, outer movement second. Marcus Aurelius wrote during plague, betrayal, and war, yet constantly reminded himself that perception determines suffering more than circumstance alone. Stoicism was never emotional suppression. It was mastery of interpretation. The Stoic understood emotional reaction distorts perception the way storm winds distort water. Still water reflects clearly, disturbed water cannot. The same principle exists within consciousness. A Renaissance alchemist once compared the human mind to a lantern covered in colored glass. The world itself remains unchanged, yet the color through which light passes alters everything perceived. Anger colors reality one way, shame another, gratitude another, fear another. Most people mistake the color for the world itself. This is why sustained emotional baselines matter profoundly. A temporary emotion passes quickly, but repeated emotions harden into atmosphere. Atmosphere shapes identity, identity shapes behavior, behavior shapes outcomes. And eventually, life begins echoing the dominant emotional frequency sustained within. This does not mean every external event is magically created by thought alone. Ancient philosophies were more nuanced than modern simplifications. Storms still come, loss still happens, uncertainty remains part of existence, but consciousness determines interpretation, response, and ultimately direction. That changes everything. A fearful mind sees difficulty and collapses. A disciplined mind sees difficulty and adapts. A bitter mind sees betrayal and closes forever. A wise mind sees betrayal and develops discernment. The outer event matters, but the internal state determines its meaning. There is an old Buddhist story about two monks traveling through heavy rain. One cursed the storm constantly while the other walked silently beneath it. Hours later, the angry monk demanded, "How can you remain peaceful in this misery?" The second monk answered softly, "The rain touches both of us. Only one keeps carrying it." Powerful words. Many people live inside emotional climates they continually recreate unconsciously. Fearful media consumption, constant comparison, rehearsed resentment, endless mental catastrophizing. These repeated states become familiar, and familiarity becomes identity. Eventually, the nervous system begins expecting chaos. Then it unconsciously searches for proof everywhere. This creates what ancient initiates understood as confirmation loops. Fearful expectation influences behavior subtly. Hesitation appears. Distrust appears. Emotional defensiveness appears. Opportunities are missed. Relationships weaken. Failures accumulate. The person concludes, "Reality is against me." Yet often their dominant state has been shaping perception all along. Confidence operates differently, not arrogance, not fantasy, but grounded internal stability. Confident individuals notice more possibilities because their attention is not consumed entirely by threat monitoring. Their emotional baseline permits broader awareness. They recover faster from setbacks because identity is not shattered by temporary failure. Their inner atmosphere supports movement instead of paralysis. Ancient initiates trained this deliberately. Egyptian mystery schools reportedly used isolation, silence, disciplined breathing, symbolic meditation, and concentration practices to stabilize consciousness itself. The goal was not escapism but internal sovereignty, because an unstable mind cannot perceive clearly, and unclear perception creates chaotic action. The Hermetic principle of correspondence teaches that inner disorder eventually manifests externally. A chronically resentful person often creates conflict unconsciously. A deeply insecure person may sabotage intimacy repeatedly. Someone consumed by urgency destroys clarity through emotional force. Internal vibration influences external interaction constantly. Even environments affect consciousness in return. Ancient traditions understood places carry emotional atmosphere. A chaotic room affects the nervous system differently than a quiet sanctuary. Likewise, The people surrounding you influence energetic baseline through conversation, emotional contagion, and repeated exposure. Everything conditions consciousness subtly. That is why awareness is essential. Without awareness, people absorb emotional states unconsciously from culture, media, relationships, and fear-driven systems. Their internal world becomes fragmented while they continue blaming only external conditions. The ancient teachers warned repeatedly, guard the inner world carefully, because what dominates attention eventually shapes identity, and identity shapes destiny. A person who practices gratitude daily is not merely thinking positively. They are conditioning perception toward abundance, resilience, and emotional expansion. Someone who constantly rehearses defeat conditions perception toward limitation and withdrawal. Over years, these patterns become dramatically visible. This is why some people remain inwardly powerful despite hardship, while others collapse beneath relatively minor pressure. Dominant emotional state determines resilience. The outer world reflects the inner interpreter, always, not instantly, not perfectly, but continuously. There is a hidden mercy in this truth as well. If reality reflects dominant state, then transformation becomes possible. Emotional atmosphere is not fixed forever. Through awareness, discipline, observation, silence, and intentional focus, consciousness can gradually reorganize itself. Fear can become clarity, anger can become direction, chaos can become wisdom. This is mental transmutation, not denial, not escapism. Transformation. The first step is observation. Observe recurring emotions daily. Observe what repeatedly captures attention. Observe how internal states alter perception of the same events. Notice how exhaustion changes interpretation. Notice how calmness changes interaction. Notice how fear predicts outcomes before evidence appears. Awareness interrupts unconscious repetition, and interruption begins freedom. Ancient Hermetic teachings insisted that humans participate in reality continuously through consciousness itself, not as omnipotent gods controlling every event, but as interpreters and energetic participants shaping experience through sustained inner orientation. Your dominant state becomes the lens through which existence unfolds. And eventually, the lens shapes the path itself. Action. Monitor emotional baseline consistently, not occasionally daily, because what you sustain internally begins echoing externally over time. And the world eventually reflects the atmosphere you refuse to release. Chapter 13. The Return to Inner Sovereignty. There is an old Hermetic parable preserved in fragments across Egyptian and Hellenistic writings. It tells of a man who once walked through a vast temple of mirrors. Each mirror reflected not his body but his thoughts. When he approached one mirror filled with fear, the reflection trembled and the world behind it appeared hostile, collapsing inward like a storm. When he stepped toward another mirror shaped by anger, the reflection became sharp, fragmented, almost violent in motion. Yet when he stood before a final mirror in complete stillness, something unexpected happened. The reflection stopped imitating him and began observing him instead. The man was shaken. "Who are you?" he asked. The reflection answered, "You forgot what you are." This is the essence of inner sovereignty, as understood in ancient wisdom traditions, not control over others, not domination of external events, but remembrance of internal authority, the recognition that consciousness participates in shaping experience long before the world seems to respond. Most of humanity has drifted into what the Hermetic texts subtly call inversion. Instead of inner command shaping interpretation of reality, outer circumstances now dictate emotional state. A delay becomes frustration, a rejection becomes identity, a loss becomes emotional collapse. External signals overwrite internal stability almost instantly. Ancient initiates considered this the fall of sovereignty. Because sovereignty is not political, it is psychological, perceptual, and energetic. It is the ability to remain centered while reality moves. It is the capacity to interpret events without surrendering identity to them. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius, ruling during war, plague, and betrayal, repeatedly returned to one essential principle: the mind is the only domain fully governed by the self. Everything else is conditional. External life may shift violently, but internal interpretation remains a domain of choice. That insight is not philosophical comfort, it is structural reality, yet modern consciousness often forgets this. People unconsciously outsource their emotional stability to external validation. A message not received becomes anxiety. A changing situation becomes confusion. A disagreement becomes personal collapse. The outer world becomes the authority, and the inner world becomes reactive commentary. This is how sovereignty dissolves. Hermetic teachings describe consciousness as participatory rather than passive. You are not simply observing life, you are interpreting it continuously through emotional and cognitive frameworks that shape meaning itself. Two people can stand in the same moment of crisis, yet experience entirely different realities because interpretation differs. One collapses inward, the other adapts. The difference is not circumstance. It is inner governance. There is a story from Neoplatonic tradition about a student who asked Plotinus how one could return to the One, the unified source of existence. Plotinus answered indirectly, "You do not travel outward to find it. You remove what prevents you from seeing it within. What prevents sight is not distance, it is distortion. Distortion comes from ungoverned thought patterns, emotional reactivity, and unconscious identification with fear-based narratives. Inner sovereignty begins when a person recognizes that thoughts are not commands, they are events. Emotions are not truths, they are states. Interpretations are not reality, they are projections filtered through conditioning. Once this distinction is seen clearly, something shifts. Space appears between stimulus and response. And within that space lies authority. A man who governs his thoughts does not suppress them blindly. He observes them, interprets them, and redirects them consciously. Fear no longer becomes automatic collapse, it becomes information. Anger no longer becomes destruction, it becomes energy requiring direction. Confusion no longer becomes paralysis, it becomes inquiry. This transformation is not suppression, it is refinement. Ancient mystery schools trained this capacity deliberately. Initiates were often placed in symbolic trials, silence, darkness, isolation, not to weaken them, but to strip away external dependency. Without distraction, the mind begins revealing its own patterns. The initiate sees clearly how thoughts arise, repeat, and shape perception. Most people never observe this process directly. They live inside it. And so they believe they are reacting to reality, when in truth they are reacting to internal interpretations of reality. Ornan sovereignty breaks this illusion. It returns authority to consciousness itself. But sovereignty is not rigidity, it is alignment. The Hermetic tradition often spoke of attunement to universal intelligence, sometimes called mind, logos, or divine order. This does not imply blind belief, but a recognition that beneath chaos, patterns exist. Beneath randomness, structure persists. Beneath emotional turbulence, awareness can remain stable. When internal mastery strengthens, external influence becomes indirect but real, not through force but through coherence. A coherent mind perceives clearly. Clear perception leads to aligned action. Aligned action produces stable outcomes. Chaos, by contrast, produces reactive fragmentation. This is why ancient teachings consistently emphasize inner order before external action. Without inner order, even correct actions become unstable. With inner order, even simple actions become transformative. A person aligned internally walks differently, speaks differently, interprets differently. Their presence changes because their internal frequency is no longer fragmented. This is the return to sovereignty, not becoming powerful over others, but becoming undivided within oneself. The mind no longer serves fear, it serves clarity, and clarity becomes direction, action. Govern thoughts deliberately, not by force but by awareness, not by control but by recognition, not by resistance but by conscious redirection, because what governs thought eventually governs experience, and what governs experience becomes the architecture of life itself. Chapter 14. The Final Law of Energy. There is an ancient teaching preserved across Hermetic fragments, Stoic reflections, and Eastern contemplative traditions that points to a single unsettling truth. Nothing in experience is neutral to consciousness, not because the universe is subjective illusion alone, but because consciousness is always participating in interpretation, emotional coloring, and meaning-making. A monk once told a student standing before a storm, "The wind is not your enemy, but your response to it becomes your world." This is the final law of energy, not as superstition, but as lived psychology and inner physics. Reality is continuously responding, not to fleeting thoughts, but to sustained internal patterns. A passing fear does not define a life. A single hopeful moment does not transform destiny. What shapes experience is repetition, emotional repetition, cognitive repetition, attentional repetition. Thoughts form emotional atmosphere. Emotional atmosphere forms perception. Perception shapes decision. Decision shapes trajectory. And trajectory becomes what is later called fate. The Kybalion hints at this through vibration. Buddhism echoes it through mental conditioning. Stoicism describes it through judgment and perception. Gnostic texts frame it as awakening from unconscious identification. Different languages converge on one principle. Sustained inner state organizes outer experience. A fearful internal environment filters reality toward threat. Even neutral events become interpreted as danger. Opportunities are missed, not because they do not exist, but because they are not perceived. A stable internal environment expands perception. The same world appears different, not because the world changed, but because interpretation no longer distorts every signal through anxiety. This is why two individuals can live identical external circumstances and yet inhabit entirely different realities. One sees limitation everywhere, the other sees possibility within limitation. One collapses under pressure, the other adapts through it. Ancient initiates treated this as energetic law. They understood consciousness as continuously shaping interpretive fields. Emotional states were not dismissed as irrelevant. They were studied like forces. Fear was recognized as contraction of awareness, anger as distortion of perception, calmness as expansion of clarity, gratitude as alignment with coherence. The final law is simple but profound. Your dominant inner state becomes your interpretive lens for reality, and that lens determines what you consistently experience as life. This is why transformation does not begin in external restructuring. It begins in observation. Before change, awareness. Before action, recognition. Before mastery, honesty. A 30-day awareness experiment was often suggested in modern interpretations of these teachings for a reason. It reveals hidden patterns that usually operate unconsciously. For 30 days, observe what thoughts repeat without permission, what emotions return automatically under stress, what reactions appear before reflection, what interpretations dominate neutral events, what internal stories shape external conclusions. At first, this observation feels subtle, then it becomes uncomfortable. Eventually, it becomes revealing, because awareness disrupts automation, and what is disrupted can be transformed. As observation deepens, a strange clarity emerges. Most suffering is not produced by events themselves, but by unexamined internal responses to those events. Fear grows through repetition. Anxiety becomes habitual interpretation. Doubt becomes default identity. These patterns feel personal, but they are largely conditioned. And anything conditioned can be reconditioned. This is the hidden optimism within ancient wisdom traditions. They do not deny difficulty, they do not deny pain, they do not deny uncertainty. Instead, they point toward agency within interpretation itself. You may not control every event, but you participate in every experience of it. This distinction is everything, because participation means responsibility, not blame, but awareness of involvement. The ability to notice that consciousness is always contributing something to the field of experience. Attention, interpretation, emotional resonance. When this is seen clearly, something subtle yet irreversible happens. You stop being purely reactive. You begin becoming observant, and observation creates space. Space creates choice. Choice creates direction. Directed creates transformation. The final law of energy is not about control over the external world. It is about recognition of continuous participation within it. Every thought contributes to atmosphere. Every emotion contributes to perception. Every repeated pattern contributes to destiny. This is not mystical abstraction. It is lived reality experienced moment by moment. And so the teaching returns to something simple, almost stark. Observe what is repeated within you, because repetition becomes atmosphere, atmosphere becomes interpretation, interpretation becomes life, and life becomes the echo of what was sustained most deeply within awareness. Action, observe thoughts, emotions, reactions daily, not once, not occasionally, but continuously enough to interrupt unconscious repetition, because awareness is not just observation, it is transformation in motion. What you repeatedly energize eventually becomes the reality you live inside. The ancients did not believe human beings were powerless. They believed humanity had forgotten its own participation in reality. The moment you begin mastering attention, emotion, and perception, reality itself begins to reorganize around a different version of you. And the deeper question is no longer whether energy is real, but whether you are finally ready to become conscious of the energy you create every single day.